So, a conversation I've probably put off for too long at this point that we really should be having is about this concept of functions. For some of you, this may seem like review because you've done other CS classes and you've heard of functions and know what functions are. But for those of you who haven't, we're going to delve into functions a little bit today and kind of what functions are, why they're useful, how we use them in JavaScript particularly, and so on. So, I've set up a very basic HTML page here just so we can run it in our browser, and I've linked this functions JavaScript file to it so we could talk about what functions are. So just to review, so far we've talked about variables, right? Some number equals 12, right? We can assign a variable. We've used some objects, right? We've used our document object to get elements by ID, right? Get elements by ID. Call this our functions header, and we can come in here and give this an ID. Right. So that kind of links the document object is something we're given automatically and kind of links to this page here, and we can get our functions header. So we would say let functions header equal this. But what are functions? We've seen them used before. When we did our form, we kind of used an on event that had a function in it, but we haven't really talked about what they are. So in it basically, a function is a block of code that you get to name and then call, meaning run, whenever you want. So for the most part, we've been used to our code kind of running, starting at the top and running down the bottom. So runs line 1, runs line 2, right? So if we do console, oh my goodness, console.log, this runs first, console.log, then this runs, right? So we've been kind of used to this. And when we refresh our page and we go to inspect our console, we can see this runs first, then this runs, right? Top to bottom. That's how this is running. Functions allow us to change a little bit how that happens by, again, labeling groups of code and then making them run when we call that label. So the way that we do that in JavaScript, I'm going to take all this out just to simplify, is we use this keyword function, and that's how we name a function. So let's name this function, and we'll call this function print hello world. Let me draw your attention to some other things. So function is our keyword. This is a name I've given our function. It does not matter what name you use. You can use whatever name you'd like. These are parentheses. What would normally go inside them is what we call parameters. We are not going to be delving too far into parameters today, but I just want you to know that's what those are for. And then the code block is bracketed by these squiggly brackets. So anything we put inside of here becomes part of our function print hello world. So let's go ahead and say console.log hello world. And let's run our code now. Stop for a moment and think about what you think our code is going to do. And then when we run it, see if it matches your expectations. Did you expect it to do nothing? The reason it's doing nothing is because we haven't actually told it to do anything here other than label this code print hello world. We're labeling this code block console with this console.log in it. We're labeling that print hello world. To make it actually happen, we would call it like this. Okay, we would say print hello world. That's us calling the function. Now if we run it, we actually get the results of what's inside this function. Hello world. What this allows us to do is we can write another function called goodbye world. Also isn't going to take any parameters. And we're going to say console.log goodbye world. Now we've defined another function. We run our code. Same thing happens. If we call our other function, now we'll see hello world, goodbye world. Now the order is not determined by my defining of the function so much as my calling of the functions, which is to say, if I were to call goodbye world before hello world, even though they're defined in opposite order, and I did it, now you'll see goodbye world before hello world. And then in fact, I could call goodbye world again, and I could call goodbye world again and again and again, and get the same results every time I call goodbye world. This is the power of functions. This idea that we can define a block of code once, use it whenever and wherever else we want in our code, and get those same results. The other option would be to rewrite these blocks of code every time we wanted them to happen. And if we don't even know at runtime, when we first start running everything, when we want them to happen, that's another issue, right? So this allows us to be more dynamic and reactive and have our code sectioned off. It also makes things more readable. If I just had lines and lines and lines and lines of code, it's hard to sometimes figure out what goes together, what's happening where. But if I separate things into functions, it's much clearer to see what happens. Okay. That's interesting, but let's see if we can make this useful, right? So let's make a function, and we're going to have it add two numbers. And this time we are going to have it take parameters, meaning we're going to give it information to work on. That information gets defined within this function. So I'm going to say num1 and num2. The only thing I have to tell my function at the beginning is what the variables are going to be called. I don't have to tell it anything else. JavaScript will try to figure out from what is passed in what kind of thing it should be doing with it. Let me show you what I mean by that. So if we had a function called add two numbers together, what we might expect it to do is say, okay, console.log num1 plus num2. And then if we called that function, we could give it two numbers, let's say the number 1 and the number 2 separated by commas, and we could see the result of calling that function given this information. Let's see. We get the number 3 to our console because our function is adding those two numbers together. And actually, we could make it even clearer by saying let sum equal num1 plus num. This is longer, but maybe more readable, right? Num2, and then having it log the sum to the console. Same result. Maybe just a little bit clearer read. So let's go over exactly what's happening again. We've named a function. We've said it's going to take two parameters, meaning two pieces of information. And this is what those pieces of information are going to be called. This is what we ask it to do with the information, add it together and store it as another variable, and then go ahead and log that variable to the console. Then we actually call the function and the information we pass it are 1 and 2. But maybe we want to change that. Maybe we want to pass it 3 and 2. When we run it, it updates to 5. So we don't have to predetermine what numbers it's adding together. We get to pass that information in. That's the power of parameters. But remember when I said earlier, we don't have to tell it what type of information it's going to get. We just have to say do something with it. Well, interestingly enough, if we were to pass it 3 and 4 as strings, what do you think is going to be the result here? pause and think about it for a second. It's going to concat the strings. It added the numbers, but that's not what this operator does with strings. It concats them and puts them together, right? What if we made these bools? What if I made this true and I made this false? What would it do? We get the number 1, which is actually representative of true. What if we made this also false and we asked them to add together? We get the number 0. It's going to always do whatever, which is false. It's going to always do whatever it can logically based on the information it's handed. Now, interestingly enough, what if we gave it the number 3 and the word 3? Let's see if JavaScript knows how to handle this. It concats it, right? It treats them both like strings. If this were the number 3 and this were the word 3, let's see what happens. It defaults to concatenating it still, right? It defaults to pushing them together like they're strings. If this were 3 and this were true, we're going to get 4. I can go into more explanation as to why we're getting 4, but on a base level, simply true defaults to 1, false defaults to 0. So this is going to be 3, right? It's going to treat them almost like numbers in this case. Okay. So that's a lot of information. What I really want you to take away, though, is that functions are blocks of code that we can name and we can pass information to. Something else I want you to be aware of is that let's for a moment say we had some variable called sum and we set it equal to 5. And we called our function add 2 numbers together and we said 1 and 0. And then after this we said console.log sum. What do you think is going to happen? And the thing I want to draw your attention to is the fact that we're using the word sum in here. We're also using the word sum out here. Before this function, we're using the word sum. So my question is, what do you think this is going to print? 5 or this? What do you think this is going to print? This prints 1 because 1 plus 0 is 1. This is referring to the local sum here, the one defined inside this function. However, defining the local sum inside this function does not overwrite the sum outside the function. Now, if we were, instead of writing let, if we were to take the let away, not redefining a variable, and just wrote sum, the assumption our function is going to take is that we want to use this global sum here. Global means available to the whole file, right? And then we get sum 5 gets overridden here as 1, and it stays 1 when we leave the function. So that's just something to be aware of, like scope. We can define a variable inside our function that only gets used inside our function that will not affect the outside, or we can also affect the outside. Ideally, you want to avoid this. If we want to affect the outside with a function like this, what we probably should do is pass it in as a parameter, and then we can affect it here, and we can return it, we can pass it in here. Okay. So now sum, and then what we could do is add on, let's go ahead and add sum on to this so we can see the change. So now there should be 1 plus 0 plus whatever sum is set to appear, which is 6. Now, it is only still changing inside this function, right? Sum stays 5 outside. This is happening locally now because it's getting passed in. But it's a better way of referencing global variables, is passing them in and then letting something come out. When I say letting something come out, by the way, the other thing we can do with a function is we can return a value. So what do I mean by that? Well, now if I run this function, let me take out console.log sum for a second. You'll notice that nothing gets printed to the console. We're not printing to the console anymore. So if we wanted to print to the console, we would have to take the value from our function and store it somewhere and then do something with it. So for example, we might say let returned sum equal this function now, and then we can console.log the returned sum. Now if we refresh, console dot, this should be log, not lof. There we go. Refresh, and you'll see 6 printed out. What's happening now is this value is returned when this function is called, and we're storing it. But it's getting pushed out. It's pushing that value out in this function. We're storing it here, and then we're logging it here. Return values are a way our functions can push values back out. And we've seen both types before. We've seen values that return something, and we've seen values that don't. Now you know document, right? Let's go back to document for a second. So document.getID, or sorry, get element by ID. There we go. What's inside these parentheses? Oh, inside of these parentheses is a attribute. And you can see that up here, right? This is an attribute that this function, get element by ID, takes. So we pass it the, I forget what we called that, functions header, right? And you know, when we normally use this function, we set it equal to something, right? So we say let functions header equal. Why? Because this function also takes a parameter, but it returns something. That's what after this colon is saying. It returns an HTML element. And if it can't find one, by the way, it returns null, meaning there wasn't an element with that ID. You can see here it even specifies that it has a parameter, and that parameter is the element ID, and it describes it for you, string that specifies the ID value. And you can see it says that it returns a reference to the first object, that the specified value of ID attribute. Okay? So this is a function with a parameter that returns a value that we then store as functions header. Okay? So one of the things I want you thinking about is how can we redefine some of the code we've made before using functions? I'm going to flip over to my tip calculator for a second and just look at this code again and talk about kind of what's happening, because you'll see the name function here. The only difference between this function and the functions we just wrote is our function here has a name. This function here does not have a name. We have a keyword. We actually have a parameter, but we have no name. We have the squiggly brackets, and then we have the block that we define. It's important to note that this function is known as an anonymous function just because it doesn't have a name. We don't really need it to have a name. We just know we're going to call it whenever this event occurs. We're going to define the block of code right here, and we're going to call it right here. We could have, if we wanted to, taken this function written function calc underscore tip, have it take an event, and called it right here. And then in our event listener up here, we actually could have said calc tip event. Or let's try just E, I think is fine. Okay. Which means we're going to still do all this, but we're going to call it, and we're going to call it and pass it into this function that we've now named down here and given a name to and everything, right? So that's another way we could have done this if we'd wanted to. We could have done a named function. It is more common to do this add event listener as a anonymous function. You'll see that more often than you will see a named function that's passed in there. Okay. That is functions. So what's your job today? Go ahead and go back and look at your tip calculator and just be aware. What I want you to do this time in your tip calculator is to separate out some of the functions that are happening here, because there's a lot happening here, and do them separately. So inside of Kick Calculator, you can keep these two lines here. These get by IDs, those are functions themselves. This element by ID is fine too, but pull this out into its own function and have that function take a bill amount, take a tip percent, and return a total bill and call it inside of your tip calc function. Okay, does that make sense? So you're basically taking this one line and separating it out into its own function, and that'll be your skills check for this video.